Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the water commons and food sovereignty. As part of the 10th anniversary celebration of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, we are holding a series of monthly online dialogues that are focused on the next food system. The first dialogue was last month, and we were debating whether the globalized industrial food system is heading for collapse. Our next dialogue will be on the water commons and food sovereignty. Today's dialogue is focused on the water commons and food sovereignty. So we are going to be delving deep into the intricate relationship between water and the fundamental right to food. This webinar is a collaborative effort to foster dialogue, to share knowledge, to foster actionable insights, to addressing the pressing issues at the intersection of water governance and food sovereignty. The concept of water commons emphasizes the collective responsibility and stewardship towards water, recognizing water as a shared heritage, crucial for sustaining life and ecosystems. And likewise, food sovereignty asserts the right of communities to control their own food system, ensuring access to a healthy, a culturally appropriate, and sustainably produced food. However, as you know, cannibal capitalism, as Nancy Fraser calls it, has been pushing to commodify and privatize our water systems. Similarly, the industrial agriculture model has been perpetuating inequality, environmental degradation, prioritizing profits over people and over the planet. In today's global context, challenges such as the climate crisis, unequal distribution of water resources, and of course, our own historical condition coming from apartheid and colonialism. These challenges highlight the urgent need for innovative approaches, for systemic alternatives from below to change the status quo as well as improve access to water for all. So throughout this webinar, we will explore the various dimensions of the food-water nexus. And to help us as we navigate this journey, we have two amazing panelists. We have Dr. Matthew Wingfield, we have Dr. Ferrell Adam. Ferrell Adam, over the past 20 years, has been an environmental justice activist in South Africa. He works in environmental justice organizations like EarthLife, like Greenpeace, has afforded her the chance to understand government policies and approaches to water. She's been a human rights activist, a climate justice activist, and she's also a member of the Climate Justice Charter Movement's executive as a climate secretary. We have Matthew Wingfield, who is a Research Fellow at Stellenbosch University and the Climate Science and Political Education Secretary for the Climate Justice Charter Movement. He has published both and presented in numerous settings on his research and political interests of spatial and environmental justice. Ferrell is going to go first, and then afterwards is going to be Matthew. They'll present for like 10 to 20 minutes each, and then we are going to open it up for discussion with all the attendees. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Ferrell, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. I have a presentation that I'm going to talk to, but I don't think I'm going to show you the entire thing because I think some of you may have seen it already. So I can't see questions, and so I think we'll take questions at the end. But Charles, if there's anything really that you can't hear me or anything, you need to speak because I'm actually looking at my screen. So in terms of water and food sovereignty in South Africa, I think the first thing we need to note is that South Africa is going to be having, or we are already having, a water crisis that could far outweigh the energy crisis that we've had for a long time. Now, often people talk about the just transition, but they don't make the linkages to water and how we use water. And so for me, I always like to just create that first linkage in terms of the state of our water commons. And that's what I want to just touch on firstly, is that we have just 2 years, or actually we have 1 year before Africa's water crisis is predicted to become a catastrophe. And that is in terms of quantity as well as quality. It is predicted that by 2025, which is next year, close to 230 million Africans will be facing water scarcity. And up to 460 million people globally will be living in a water-stressed area. So with that, you're going to definitely have an increase in food insecurity and poverty. And that's the state, the linkages and why we need to talk about water. Just to say that water injustice is a very real thing that we're feeling across the board. At least 2 billion people use a drinking water source that's contaminated with feces. So when we take up the issues, and when I go into the state of water in South Africa, this becomes a real concern because at least 829,000 people die each year from diarrhea as a result of drinking unsafe water. Now, when we look at climate change, because we can't talk about water, we can't talk about food without also talking about climate change. When we talk about climate change, UNICEF did a study not so long ago that showed that a change in climate is felt primarily through a change in water. And what they found is that 74% of natural disasters between 2001 and 2018 were all water related. Droughts, floods, and we're seeing the frequency and the intensity of these increasing, and we are not able to manage or cope with what is going on in with regards to climate change. And in South Africa, we're not immune to that. I don't know if people remember the rain bomb in KZN. In that same week, we had rain and floods in the Western Cape. We had the fires in the Western Cape, and we also had droughts in Eastern Cape. So this was all hitting South Africa in 1 week. So let's talk about South Africa and the state of our water resources. We know the challenges. We know that we will not have enough water supplies to meet demand by 2025. We know that we live in a water scarce country. Our river ecosystem, so it's not just about the water, it's about the river ecosystems, the plants, the trees, the bugs, the frogs, the fish are not in a healthy state. 60% is threatened at the moment because of climate change and because of human activities. And 52% of our drinking water supply systems across the country are questionable, and they should not be drunk by anyone. So that is also, half of our water from our taps that should be okay is not okay. If you're in the big metros like City of Joburg, some parts of eThekwini, Cape Town, it is still okay. We're still in a very unequal society in that only 46% of South Africans actually have a tap inside their home, right? 27% on a property, 12% walk 200 meters to get water, 10% rely on rivers and streams and wetlands. And why that is important brings me to the next point, which is government's Blue Drop report. At least 70% of our wastewater treatment works are officially classified as poor to critical. That means it's not operating properly, and that means you have at least 50,000 liters of sewage flowing into our rivers per second. So let's just recap quickly what I've said in terms of the quality of water. We have, in the state of our water, we're a water scarce country. We do not have enough for demand. Then we have pollution. So we have pollution from sewage. We have pollution from mining, from farming and agriculture. We have a lot of people that don't have access to clean drinking water. So basically, we're looking at a state of rivers and state of water in South Africa that's actually quite bleak. And then let's just talk about the link to food, because if you have high levels of sewage flowing into your rivers and streams, then it becomes, if you're using that water for agriculture, as is most small farmers, you are then infecting your food. So you have to, because sewage is one thing. Sewage is an indicator that there may be other pathogens in your water, like hepatitis, cholera, etc. So then what you're saying is that small farmers do not have clean water for their crops, which then affects food supply. So that's the linkages in terms of the infrastructure, the state of our water, and food systems. What we are doing is we're trying to create awareness around that, and by building activist citizen science. So having everyone on the ground be able to test the water around them. It's not only so that we know what is going on, but also using those tests as the building block to build the movement and to build our activism from the ground. And that's what we need to do. That is where we're at in terms of South Africa. We know that, if I can give you some examples of where this is happening, we know that a lot of the Orange River feeds into our crops. And it's not just the small farmers in and around Gauteng. In fact, I was on a talk yesterday where someone said there are no farmers in Gauteng, so we don't have to worry about access to water, which is not true. We do have farmers, they just not the big scale ones and the problematic ones. And the challenge though is that now, because our water is polluted, it's affecting all of our food streams. It's affecting the big commercial farmers, it's affecting the small farmers, and the small farmers are the ones that are hit hardest because they don't have alternative water supplies. Also, what is happening with both water scarcity and the quality of water, so water quantity and quality, is that it's opening the doors for privatization. And that for me is a concern. Water is a resource that should never be privatized, right? And if we look at the city of Joburg as an example, where we've had intense water outages. Now for the change, it's affecting people in urban areas, middle class areas, and in Joburg, which is supposed to be the economic hub. People are becoming more and more angry and are taking to the streets. And I don't think it's going to end here. I think that people are going to be demanding more and more just water justice and having the right to clean, sustainable drinking water. What is concerning, and I mentioned this, is the growing rise of the private sector to offer services to people. So what is happening in many areas is that more wealthier families, and I just heard this the other day, which I found most appalling, in the street with very wealthy people, they just together put 6,000 each, and they got their own water tanks, their own for their street only. They paid for it. Now, that is something for me that is becoming more and more concerning in terms of our water resources. I want to leave it there. We can have more discussions in terms of, I was told to talk about water, the state of water, climate change, and how this impacts on our food. Our water crisis should have us on high alert. It's not going to be solved with a WhatsApp group. We need to build a movement. We need to have collective voices and action, because it is the one thing that can unite us across class, race, area, rural, urban, and we have to build on that instead of using it to divide us. We have to engage with government and local government, etc., because they're not going to solve this problem on their own. What we're seeing in Joburg is clearly a site that the city has lost control of the issue. We need to connect with other groups in other cities, in other municipalities, in other provinces. We need to also have face-to-face discussions on these. We need to demand accountability as people. And what that means different things depending on where we are and how we're dealing with it. For me, running to the court should be the last source, the last port. The first part should be us organizing ourselves and building a movement. Thank you. Charles, I hope I covered everything.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for your input, and thank you for taking us through the challenges that our water commons are facing. Without taking any further time, Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Let me just share the slides. I hope it's visible. Charles?
Yes, it's visible, Matthew.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Hi to my friends, my colleagues, comrades. Some of you will know me. I'm Matthew Wingfield. I'm a research fellow at Stellenbosch University, but I think more importantly, I'm the Climate Science and Political Education Secretary of the Climate Justice Charter Movement. And I think Ferial's done an amazing job of sketching the landscape of water in our country, something that is so fundamental. And, you know, we think about just in the general thrust of the transition from apartheid and the colonial era in South Africa, and we think about various forms of access to different infrastructure, to work, to voting, but how often do we think about the access and the continued struggle to access water and clean water for drinking and for not only drinking and consumption, but for economic benefit? And that's what I'm going to speak to in my presentation. It's just a handful of slides, but just some interesting pictures, I think. Industrial agriculture and the water commons. I start with this picture, I think is important. I lived through the drought in the Western Cape from 2017 to 2019, known as Day Zero, where the city of Cape Town really has been praised in some ways for missing Day Zero, the moment where they'll turn off municipal water supply, right? So we had this, we had a drought, there was lack of water supply, and there was, as Farah was saying, there's a lack of investment, there's lack of conscientious control and dealing with water resources in our country. And what it got to in Cape Town, as it is in Joburg, and it is across the country at the moment, eThekwini and across the country, the access to water and water availability is becoming a problem. And often I think that this is, you know, with City of Cape Town coming through this crisis, some people have assumed that, oh, well, it doesn't matter what the environment does, we can govern, we can figure it out. I am here to destabilize that a bit and push back against that kind of way of thinking about the climate crisis, of course, but also just water in general and water scarcity. So we often think about farming when we think about who's using the most water in the country, and this and the lack, the sort of dwindling water resources we have in South Africa. It's of course the agricultural industry uses 60% of South Africa's total water use. You can find different figures, but I think what I need to show here, rather than trying to find a perfect figure, is trying to show that it is a very significant amount, and that is often commercial industrial agriculture. So often this is seen as a no-brainer. Of course, they have to use water. We need to use water so that food can be grown, right? And this is even during Day Zero. I have some statistics on this just now in the next slide. But there was sort of a justification that we're in a drought, there's a lack of water, certain industries are being cut off, certain ways of interacting with water from an individual level to an industrial level, to a corporate level have been limited, but yet agriculture must get water, right? That is one fundamental use case of our water resources. It must go into farming and growing food. But however, we see the connection between food and water, right? That tries to justify that water should be used, but it's a bit more complicated. 2.6 million South Africans have inadequate access to food. 1.1 million have severe inadequate access to food. 21% of South Africans do not have adequate access to food. So this is again the justification that we need to make sure that water is used for farming. We need to scale up farming rather than scaling down or questioning farming relationships with water. We should rather scale up, right? I think that's a very problematic way of thinking about the problem. But I think there's a lot of people, commentators, academics, policymakers that are thinking like this. And it is a very, very flawed approach, certainly when we are in the context of the climate crisis. So droughts and flooding, this is water variability really, bring the relationship between food and water security into question really. There's a relationship between them, but we need to question, what is that relationship? What has it been in the past? And why is that relationship? Why why is commercial agriculture and industrial agriculture so dependent on water, for one? And secondly, what allows that to be the case? What allows for water use licenses to be granted historically through land ownership and now in very many ways, but to privilege commercial industrial agriculture? Why is it like that? That comes from the colonial history and apartheid history that we have in our country. So I want to ask the question, and I think this is a question we're all asking, what is the just use of water in food provision? And I guess this is not a question of just in the sense that a government policy think tank will say just, or a stakeholder from a local government, the city of Cape Town, will say what is just. I'm thinking, as Ferial has asked us, what if we connect the social movements, the groups that are working around water across the country, but on a grassroots level, and if we connect those perspectives, what is just from their perspective? And I think this is a very important way of not reading a report and saying this is just, or this is how water should be used. But we must think about who are the users, who are those that are left out or excluded from the use cycle. So let me give you a bit of context of some research I've done. And this is just my also lived experience of living in Cape Town during a drought. There was already a critique of industrial agriculture, commercial agriculture before the drought, of course, we know that well. But I saw my research tracks and the activist work that I've done has shown how it was important. The Day Zero drought was really important in trying to sharpen a critique against industrial agriculture. When water access and provision seems without question, maybe as Ferial projected, this is not going to be really the case in South Africa, or Africa for a very long time, I think. But when water access is not questioned, then there's who's using water and why they're using it and how much they're using isn't that much of a question. However, when there's a drought, as we will see, increasing drought, increasing flooding, it's both drought and flooding. Who gets to use water, and what kind of questions can we, as activists, as academics, as stakeholders, can we bring up around water use? So agriculture accounted for 57% of South African water use in 2014, and then it rose to 67% in 2018, and is forecast to keep growing. Should we allow this because food provision is important and hunger is increasing? I want us to investigate that relationship. You'll see in this image on the slide that in the red boundary, that is the Philippi horticultural area, just outside of Cape Town, top left of the image, if I think we're looking at it the same way, is the waterfront. So within 20 kilometers of Cape Town CBD, we have a farming area, right? Which is very important, and a lot of people don't know about it. But the same story, even within the center of Cape Town, really, and we have the same story about water access and water control. So this area, I would just want to point out also the broader boundary on that image. If you see the darker boundary throughout the entire, that is an underground aquifer, which, Ferial's talking about access to above ground water, but also, and she points to this, underground water is an increasingly a site of contestation and contamination throughout South Africa. So we can't only think about sites of pollution when we can see it, when waterways, when rivers are polluted and we can see it. That's one question we should have. What about underground water resources? So the PHA, this area in the red, is an area that's been farmed since the 1850s by German immigrants. But the dependence of those German immigrants brought in by the British administration, they were dependent on the underground aquifer. From 1850s all the way, their descendants are still on the land, of course, in the PHA, which you'll see mostly of that green kind of hue here. And you will also see the blue dots in there, which is, of course, showing the water table, how high the water table is. So water use and dependence on water, underground water resources, is really the story of this Philippi horticultural area, but of farming places and areas for farming across the entire country. So here again, we see the politics of access to water, but in a bit of a different way. Who gets to access underground water? This is an important question. And it's not only an important question now, it's going to be increasingly an important question and a contentious question. Underground water is accessed through technology, right? And that technology is mediated by capital. Who has the money to put in a borehole? Who has money to put in windmills? Who can extract this water from underground? And who can benefit from that extraction? This is wealthy farmers, often wealthy white farmers, and they will continue to benefit. So when back in day zero, there was a lack of access to water from streams, rivers, and easily accessible water points, who was benefiting from underground water resources? Largely farmers in this area, landowners and descendants of these German farmers. So here, I think this is often the saying that the PHA is drought-proof, but this is not only the PHA, this area that I'm talking about. This is across the country, Graaff-Reinet, and a range of other areas across South Africa and Africa depend on underground water resources. But and they have more benefit even when we go into scarcity. So what I'm basically trying to say here, if you take a step back, is who has accessed property in the past, who has benefited from being located above underground water resources, and who will benefit in the future? It's a similar group, and we really need to destabilize that, I think. In the PHA, the site, you see it on the Cape Flats, of course, a classic part of apartheid's spatial legacy of pushing unwanted non-white people to the periphery. People living in the PHA that weren't farmers, that weren't landowners, in the past and now cannot access water. As Ferry was saying, they have to walk at least 10, 20, 30 minutes to pick up water, to fetch water, when farmers are irrigating their crops and benefiting from it. So, what my question is, really is, can we mobilize crises? And there's a range of ways in which we can mobilize crises, but increasingly our world, through the climate crisis, will be characterized by these climate shocks, as Ferry was talking about. You'll see the book reference on the top of the slide, 60 Harvests Left. This is really a projection of, if we don't stop commercial industrial agriculture now, this is where we're off to. The soil is depleted, water resources are depleted, laborers are depleted. So can we stop this farming system that has given us food, but at what cost? Karl Marx called it metabolic rift. We call it depleting the soil and destroying the environment for the benefit of commercial farmers, and maybe even food. But for at what cost? I also put a QR code there for a very short article that I wrote as part of the Climate Justice Charter on water commons and commercial agriculture. And so to end off my presentation, I want to speak about the perspectives that can take us forward, as Ferry was talking about. There's connections between people, there's ways of mobilizing people, but there's also ways in which we need to, as activists, as scholars, as policymakers, to rethink the way in which we consider the environment and what it should be used for. So you will see, and I'm sure you are all part of these conversations around the People's Food Sovereignty Act, but the Food Sovereignty Act, even in 2018, was projecting, and prior to that, was projecting what would come and what we would need to do. Some have called this prefigurative politics, trying to lay out a formula for what we need to, what kind of agreements do we have to have with ourselves, with government, to make sure that we don't go on this path. And this is the Climate Justice Charter's politics as well. How do we make a stop and say there are different ways of interacting with nature and each other? I picked out two very short parts of the People's Food Sovereignty Act, 11.1, which speaks to, well, I'll quote it: water shall be recognized as a source of life and a public good, not a private or business Good. Integral for life in all ecosystems and shall therefore be used sustainably. And this is not sustainably in the sense that politicians or policymakers or even the SDGs talk about, perhaps. This is, I think, is sustainability that speaks to, through an eco-feminist perspective, perhaps, around people and the environment benefiting, and not only just making sure that there's tariffs, etc., and that's only a capital-intensive exercise. And the second one, 12.1, all small-scale food producers, as Farrell was mentioning, have the right to adequate water infrastructure. This is, of course, not the case across South Africa at the moment. All small-scale food producers have the right to adequate, I've double-quoted that. Anyway, so I think this is a very important thing around commercial and industrial farming versus small-scale. What is capital intensive and what are economies of scale and who has the money to put into agriculture. And this is the logic that the government buys into, and emerging farmers, this is what they have to buy into. We must produce, we must expand in our scale, and we must use resources as much as possible so that we can increase our profit and our production. These are questions we need to ask. So the PHA campaign, even before the drought, was arguing that water access and use needs to be reconfigured. Should commercial farmers that are degrading the environment, degrading soil, degrading water resources, be allowed to access significant water resources just because they can grow a lot of food? I think everyone in this room would argue against that. But however, I want to also show that we are not passive in this moment of increasing climate shocks across our continent. The PHA campaign was able to use the day zero moment to highlight these perspectives. And as Farrell was saying, we can find ways of using the increased impact that these climate shocks have politically, economically, socially, to push forward these perspectives that have been raised already in the People's Food Sovereignty Act and in a range of other forums. So I question here around what is water justice? What can it be? What should it be in a world of systemic crises? How should it connect with food, water, health, and state capacity? We have water in common with each other, but as a life force to make us live, but also water brings us in common. But what if we treat water as a commons? If we access it, and the politics of access, use, control, provision is mediated through equitable and just social relations, not only in this sort of neoliberal, post-apartheid sort of neoliberal context. So the last thing I'll raise is around a systemic, deep, just transition, which is of the politics of the Climate Justice Charter and a justice-based politics. What is just? And not only seen through, as Farrell said again, not only seen through a court case and what the South African government might pronounce, but what is just for people and what is just for the rights of future generations as well? What is just for not now, but for our kids as well and future generations? With that, I'll say thank you very much. I'll also just bring your attention to this bottom picture. This is the Vegkop polyculture farm that the PHA campaign run. And really, when I think about what are future ways of living, interacting with water and natural resources, I think of this. There's ways in which, even if it's on a small scale, we can promote different ways of interacting with the world so that we can live in a more just and equitable world. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Farrell. And thank you to the PHA campaign, of course, for their support.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, Farrell. Thank you both for taking us through the landscape of the challenges that we face with regard to water in South Africa. And of course, raising critical issues that need to be addressed urgently. I think Farrell laid the picture, the foundation quite well at the beginning. And then you took it to the next step, especially bringing in the issue of the PHA, the Philippi Horticultural Area. The National Water Act and the Water Services Act created a legal framework where the privatization of water was not in our laws. But unfortunately, that has more or less been de jure and not de facto, not being evident on the ground, as evidenced by many small-scale farmers, as evidenced by many communities, as I think has been indicated in the chat, who are perpetually living in absolute day zero. Day zero became national news when the drought sort of migrated to the city of Cape Town. And then there was sort of a national discussion about it, but it's an issue that several communities are currently living with and are currently facing even now. Just one issue, Matthew, I'd like you to touch upon the issue of what has been termed as the borehole bourgeoisie, where the rich are digging boreholes for themselves, sort of making themselves water sovereign in a water scarce country, and also avoiding many of the challenges that people are facing, that communities are facing. How much is that a threat to sort of a de facto privatization of our water system? And how much of it is a threat basically to our groundwater? Because South Africa has very high levels of evapotranspiration. We don't have much groundwater to play with in the beginning. So I'd just like you to touch on that.
Thank you, Comrade Charles. Yes, it's a great question. And Fatima, you've raised in the chat around perpetual day zero, really, and people in Limpopo and across the entire country and continent not able to access water. And this is not like a once-off thing. It's perpetual. It's very, very important. And it's a really good point. But as Charles is saying, I think the borehole bourgeoisie, what happens around, I think this is what happens around water scarcity across the country. When there is water scarcity, we just see people sinking boreholes and making sure that they have access. So, you know, talking to a colleague the other day about, of course, that, and the same thing goes with energy. Just going off the grid because of inadequate access to electricity, or when people feel like energy supply is being disrupted too much, they go off the grid. It's interesting, but it's not the way we should think about interacting with each other. And certainly water is even more of a complicated politics because it's finite. So mostly. So when wealthy people are accessing underground water and using it and dropping boreholes like they did in Day Zero, like they've done across the entire country, whose water are they using? And it's more like, oh, if they can pay and if they have the money to get a borehole, then that's fine. They can do that. I completely disagree, and I think there should be more questioning around who gets to use water and what are they using it for, and should it only be mediated by money, capital? So I think that's really, it's an interesting question. So if you frame, then as I was prompting at the end, underground water as a commons, will there be different discussions? The government isn't. Of course they're not. They're not framing the underground water as a commons, a common resource for the benefit of all people. They're wondering, can they make sure that they have people have boreholes and people are paying for water? So yeah, Charles, it's a really interesting question, and I think the response to water scarcity by private individuals and citizens by dropping boreholes is emblematic of the biggest challenges we're going to have to face as we face face climate shocks. And yeah, we have to develop a transformative politics around that.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Ferial, do you want to add on the issue of the borehole bourgeoisie, but also touch upon the emerging issue of what some people have termed to be the water tanker mafia?
So thanks, Charles. Sorry, I got knocked off internet-wise, but yes. So there's the water tanker mafia, right? Where you have businesses that then have tanks and then they get outsourced. They are outsourced by municipality. What I'm talking about is even worse. It's not being outsourced by municipality, so there is no link to the municipality. They basically buying water tanks and they're charging like 60,000, 70,000 just to do a street. So that street I told you about, 6,000 rand a house to have that water tanks there at their disposal so that they can use as and when they please. I wasn't sure what the question was about. And yes, there's the borehole bourgeoisie. In terms of the borehole bourgeoisie, what is happening is that when you have crises, there are people who will just drop a borehole and they don't care, they can pay for it. The concern is that when we talk about the fact that we're running out of water, you forget that that groundwater is part of the water cycle. So they are using water, and that's what we've been saying that the department needs to do. It needs to better regulate groundwater, because then you people just abstract it as they like. Also, what we found is legally, constitutionally, you know that you cannot own water. Water is, it belongs to everyone, and it's the state that is the custodian of our water sources. But I came across a group that had a piece of land, and they were given this piece of land, and they were like, well, the water underneath here is ours. And I said, no, it's not. It belongs. And they said, well, what? So they came to me to find out how to test the borehole water because they wanted to sell it. So I said to them, you can't sell your water because you need a water use license, but also water belongs to all. And they basically said, watch us. So without having adequate checks and balances, enforcement, people are running rampant, and the water crisis is here, comrades. It's here. There was a question on the side that I can't see that was actually directed to me, but I can't see those questions now because I was kicked off and I came back in. Charles, can you see there was one specifically to me?
Yes, there was a question from John, and I think John's question relates to if municipalities are failing to provide services like water provision, how best do we guard against privatization? Because when the state provides, when the state fails to provide services, then privatization begins to creep in. And perhaps in response to John's question, Ferrier, you can also talk about the state of our water boards and some of our water catchment management agencies.
They don't exist. The catchment management agencies don't exist. They were supposed to be, they started off, we're going to have 11, then we're going to have 9. I think we only have 2 catchment management agencies, and we have quite a few catchment management forums. And those were supposed to be about having co-governance over our water. So you'll have all stakeholders, all people affected by water in a catchment area, which theoretically is really good, right? But what was happening is if you take some of these catchment areas and these catchment management forums, it's industry heavy and dominant. So even their communities don't have proper access. People are saying, well, yeah, it's not allowed to actually sell water from boreholes. It's actually illegal. So those people, someone should be, tell them that someone should call the police or tell someone, because that's just completely illegal. The other thing you mentioned is how do we, those kind of things, that's privatizing the water. So people need to stop buying that water and actually saying that water should be free to everyone, and get the community to march to that person and say, you are not allowed to sell this water. And if you are, can you please show us your water use license? Simple. If not, you need to get them to go to jail, or you need to write directly to the Green Scorpions and tell them to investigate. That's what I would do. We need to build the activism. We need to build our voices against privatization. So when we have water shutdowns and droughts and the tanks come in for it's supposed to be a short while. When it starts going on for 2 months, that's when you say we don't want these tanks. People have the right to object to having the tanks. And we need to say to government that unless it's government-owned tanks during those times, we don't want them. Because it's those mafia. I mean, think about it. There's one family in KZN that owns the most number of water tanks in Southern Africa. I don't even have to tell you who that family is. That name is known. It's that corruption family that's gotten into all of these nooks and crannies everywhere. I mean, that's your claim to fame? You have the most number of water tanks in Southern Africa? So that's completely unacceptable. In terms of the water boards, look, I think, to be honest, the national department has been cleaning up a 10-year rot. The new minister, the new DG, we may not agree on everything, but they literally have cleaned up a failing department, a department that was gone to shit. And they've cleaned it up, they've put good people in, and they're trying to fix things. So I think that they're dealing with a backlog of 10 years of letting this department go to hell and corruption and mismanagement. And they slowly cleaning it. And they're doing the same with the water boards. So that is there. But the water boards are this very odd kind of structure. So let me give you an example of Rand Water, right? You have national department, and under national department, you have Rand Water. Rand Water is a water body, a water board, and they report to the national department, they report to the minister. They're the bulk abstractors. They abstract water for purification, and then they sell the water to the municipalities. Rand Water sells water to 4 or 5 provinces. Municipalities are so messed up. So then municipalities get the water in their reservoirs and then they sell it to people. They get money from people. But municipalities are losing large amounts of water through leaks. We are losing as a country about 44% of our water, 46% of our water through non-revenue water. Non-revenue water is leaks, non-billable water, and water that's being stolen. Every time we talk about water that's being stolen, someone pictures this like poor communities tapping into the water. That's not how it works. Water is being stolen by big corporations mining that are operating without water use licenses, that are not paying properly for water. So anyway, that's the one issue. But municipalities are getting their money. They are not paying Rand Water. So then you've got a water board that is being now choked, because that's their lifeline. They're supposed to sell the water to the municipalities, get paid for it. They're not being paid, and they are being told that they need to give a service. So it's this kind of funny system that's working, but the bottom line, the rot starts with local government, and that's where we need to fix it, and that's where my biggest concerns lie.
Thank you so much, Cory. Yes, Matthew, can add.
Yeah, I just want to respond somewhat to Bulelani's question, and just to say, of course, infrastructure is failing and so on. I don't have a solution, but what I do have is the warning basically Ferriol and I are giving is that what the lack of investment into infrastructure historically and now, the lack of really making sure that our water resources can get to who needs to get them, and making sure that we are protecting against water scarcity. It should sketch out now how dire this question around water is. Some people think of it as a background thing. It's not that important. Health is more important. Governance is more important. All these other things. Water is fundamental, but also fundamentally problematic. So it's not a secondary issue, and it's certainly not a future issue. It should have been addressed 10 years ago, and there's not enough. I think really what this is sketching out is if we wait for the state to respond only, and we wait for the state to respond in their own terms when they get there, it's not going to be addressed properly. As Ferriol was saying, there are things that change in the bureaucracy, but that also comes from various probes and pushes from civil society, from activists, from communities. And this is something that we can't just be silent on and hope that it'll get better. And what we're showing really is that we're going into way worse circumstances. This has sort of been, to some degree, business as usual. We haven't had the full impact, full force of the climate crisis yet. These climate shocks have been relatively chilled. So what we're about to go into, we should have far more robust systems, and we should have far more investment and governmental focus, and across the board, civil society as well, on making sure that we can face what's coming. Because if we can't address what the sort of normal kind of way of living, can't even address water scarcity and water provision in that forum, we're in for a very bumpy ride.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Colleagues, feel free to raise your hands to ask your questions. You are also welcome to post your questions in the chat. I'd like the two of you, Matthew and Ferriol, just to touch on the issue of there was a survey, I think, that was done in 2015 by the department, which found that out of about 5,000 dams, only 320 belonged to the government. So can you touch on the issue of private dams? And now that is actually a move towards the privatization of our water commons, especially, of course, in the context of the climate crisis. Ferial and then.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when you see that, when I first saw that number of having 5,000 dams, I was like, I'm sure we don't have 5,000 dams. And then I realized that the bulk of that is actually farmers who have dammed up rivers and streams. And they use that water for agriculture, and they've got permission to do that, right? So that's the challenge. But that is the one concern. Even mines have dams, and the dams, when they look at dams, they look also at the slimes dams and everything. Everything is regarded as a dam. So it's not necessarily only a water dam. But having said that, because of the backlogs in government, because we had a minister from hell at the Department of Water and Sanitation, we didn't do the proper maintenance and audits on our dams. So right now, we are sitting with 90% of our dams across, whether it's private, government-owned, that the safety of those dams are being questioned because they have not been checked properly for a long time. So they're supposed to be able to do checks on these dams for the safety. 90% of them, they have not done it. So we're sitting on dams that we don't know. That's on the one issue in terms of safety, right? In terms of privatization, it is such a big problem because what has happened was there's this old legislation and the new regulation, by the way, the new amendments to the National Water Act and the Water Services Act are trying to reverse this, right? Because what has happened was during the apartheid years, farmers had this agreement for their water. And then when in 1994, for some reason, government didn't change that. So what it basically does is it gives farmers ownership over the water on their land for farming. And they've been able to just do whatever they want. So I know of a case where the farmer was upstream and there were two emerging farmers downstream. And the farmer at the top, it was a drought. It was during that Cape Town drought. The farmer at the top diverted the water into a dam on his land. Legally, completely, you can't do that. It's illegal to do that. But he had this old piece of paper that allowed him to. That is a historical kind of document from the old apartheid system that was still in place. So he diverted the water, and those two poor farmers downstream were fighting. They lost their money, and their farms died. And they're still fighting. It's still a legal battle. They haven't won. But the new legislation, and you'll see this, so watch it out there. The new amendments basically says, if you have a body of water and you're not using it for any purpose, that the rights can be taken away from you. And the farmers across the country were up in arms. That's why you had AfriForum and AgriSA saying that these amendments are terrible. But it's reverting back that control of water. So yeah, we see.
Yeah, really, really interesting response there, Farrell. Yeah, just to say, coming to, you think about water, it's exactly the same politics as I was raising and Farrell was raising around upstream and downstream. Who has the capital to build a dam and who benefits from it? And who will continue to benefit from it. So I think there's really a question around, there's a question around, of course, who's in the Food Sovereignty Act. There's one of the parts of it talks about public access to dams, and public benefit of dams. So I think there's ways of, I think dams are really just emblematic of apartheid kind of political economy of water, having access of white farmers to water resources and making sure that they benefit from it. And now that only increases. So it's not, that's why I keep saying it's not only drought. What happens when there's flooding? Being able to capture some water and then benefit after the fact will come to those that already have the money to build dams in the past. So I think we need to think more carefully about who's accessing water, and if it is above ground water, like Farrell was saying, around dams and diversion of streams and so on. You know, it's illegal, but there's a lot of people doing it, and they will benefit more so from it. So yeah, I think it really is. We need to think about a new politics of access and control of water, and not just making sure that we question it, but certainly question it increasingly so, and in various forms. There's a policy framework and a legislation framework that's important, but also just Farrell knows better than I on this, but just around who's in that area, who knows that farmers are accessing in different ways, who knows farmers are building dams, does the state have the capacity to keep tracking who's building dams and what they're using it for? It's really tricky. And if we think that's going to happen, it's not. So can we as communities use our networks and our lived experiences around farms and farming communities to raise these questions? I think that's also a very important part of this entire conversation.
Thank you very much both for those very powerful insights. John, you have your hand up. Please go ahead and unmute.
Thank you so much, Charles. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to the speakers. It's quite an insightful presentation. It actually reminds me of the research that my colleagues and I have recently done that relates to the issues of water security, energy, and food security. We called it WEF Nexus, particularly focusing on the rural communities. And it actually, I think one of the things that I want to speak to ties well with what Ferial raised in terms of water privatization. So one of the things that we sought to do in our research is to try to look for solutions to some of these challenges. And I just want to, pick a Ferial's brain. Perhaps Matthew could also have his views. I want to find out, from you, do you think perhaps such instruments, if I could call them that, such as public-private partnership, do you see them as part of the solution to, this implied water privatization that is happening, that you're raising a concern against? And there is also one instrument, but that could be the discussion for another day, that we also discovered, that we learned about in our research, which we called water, food, energy communities, where the communities, poor communities in particular, come together with the common goal to address issues pertaining to it. Could either be energy, could either be food security, insecurity, it could either be water insecurity. Do you perhaps see such tools as solutions, or could be the solutions to this water privatization that you are talking about? Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, John. Maria, do you want to go?
So in terms, thank you for that question, John. I think if we look at public-private partnerships, there's always the leaning towards the private. So I think that not all are bad, and you do get public-private partnerships that are necessary, and they actually get things done. But at the end of the day, when we come to the water side and energy side, what I'm seeing is it's a lot of private. And this whole thing of government can't do it for themselves, they're so messed up, they have to give it to the private sector. I'm sorry, the UK gave all of their water to the private sector and it's completely destroyed. So that's, by the way, I'm just digress there. But in terms of what we need, I think no one's actually talked about a co-governance of our water. The idea of our Water Act and the water policies that we have was about a co-governance, but it's never about a co-governance. And a co-governance is not just about private partnerships that don't listen to the people on the ground or the communities being affected. It becomes very much a two-way street. It's, private makes money from it. It's profitable. And for the public, it's providing the services because they're not doing it because they mismanaged funds. But not all private partnerships work. There have been cases in South Africa where those private entities have done shoddy work. Let's talk about the many RDP houses that people had to build. Those things were worse than anything. It is better to stay in a tent because some of those houses were completely broken. Of course, after being exposed and after people stole money, that the houses were improved. But that was a public-private partnership to get that going. Let's talk about another public-private partnership that totally failed, was the installation of solar water geysers on people's homes. Goodness me, you'd swear the sun is going like this around our homes, because you'll have a water geyser facing that way and then that way and then that way. And that's not how solar water geysers work. And that was private partnerships. People then hated solar because they weren't getting hot water. So, and they didn't put into place having plumbing to fix the leaks. Because let's be honest, this whole idea that poor households is 4 people is a very old, backward idea. That's not the case. There's always more than 4 people. So the kind of giving them those RDP houses with a small toilet and a small geyser, things would break. So you needed to get those things fixed for poorer communities. So it didn't work on that front. And let's talk about roads. They talk about public-private partnerships in terms of our roads, where we have our e-tolls. I'm not talking about e-tolls in Johannesburg. I'm talking about the toll roads. Have you ever wondered where the money for those toll roads are going? And they increase it every year. It's almost as expensive to drive from Joburg to Cape Town than to fly because of the toll fees. So, and then you have to stay over and all of that. But that's another public-private partnership where the only people who got rich on that was the private. So for me, it's about co-governance, and I do think that there are cases that have worked well. I can't think of them right now, but I'm sure there are. And I do think that we need to look at co-governance so that people have an equal say. Just because we don't have that money doesn't mean that we should not be included in the decision making.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Ferrier.
Yeah, John, very interesting question. I think this is the problem around, questioning governance or the state governance, and we just say, well, a lot of people just say, well, it's bad. Sometimes it's not. Can we think about, and let me just say the reverse of that. Some people think when it's community-led or privatized, it will be good. But it's not always. So there's questions of it's very case specific, and what is the impetus for people to do it? So I think co-governance is seemingly just in a hybrid form. It seems, oh, this will be great. There's interest from the state, there's interest from the people, and this should work. There's just the way in which those engagements take place, the values, the set of values that each party come with, the timelines that they're willing to endure and work through, I think are very important. The amount of money that people are willing to be paid. There's so many specific elements of each of these collaborations and relationships, and it could have worked for 1 year and then another year it can't. So I think while sometimes we think about hybrid or the co-governance as it seems like an obvious answer, maybe it's less dependent on who exactly is the hybridity of that relationship, and rather the principles on which it's set and so on. And just to say to Lawrence's question around, but also communities, we always think if communities are involved, it's going to be better. They'll be more grounded. Is that always the case? Do communities have the capacity? Do they have the time? Do they have the ability to make sure that they connect to these governance processes for a very long period? The activists that I've worked with across the country and the activists that are in this room, you give your entire life and your time to building up and in capacity building and creating robust debate, etc. But who can do that, and for how long can they do that? I think these are really important questions. So,
I
John,
think
really
so,
interesting.
Matthew, if I can jump in, sorry, on that. I think that when we talk about community participation, it's not about being involved in it all the time. It's about having that initial that phase, that there must be phases throughout where you consult, where you talk about things, and people can do that. I mean, in my experience, people do know what they want. They do know how the river flows. Do not build there because there's a wetland. Ask the people who've been living there. They know these things. So I do think that there's an element of that. Yes, I think that where I think you're picking on that community, maybe partnerships do not work, is it's linked to the private. It's where somebody takes over and wants to get rich. And that is a problem. And I think you're right there, that's when it just falls apart, because it's self-serving. And at any point when it's self-serving, it is. Comrades, I have to leave, but I want to say to the issue on the rivers, like Mfolozi, you're very right. There's a lot of sand mining happening in KZN and illegal sand mining. And not only are they affecting river flow and causing flooding, but they also affecting the river ecosystems. And no one's monitoring that well enough. It is a huge, huge, huge eco challenge that we have, and that we need to figure out what to do. I don't think we have the answers. It's one of those things. But I really must apologize. I have to rush off. Charles, is that okay?
Thank you so much, Ferial, for making the
Sorry,
time.
it's the first day of Ramadan. The office needs to close and I need to go to my family, and it's a long day. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Ferial. We appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Nice to see you, Matthew. Bye.
Yes, Farrell.
Cheers. I'd just like to add on the issue that Ferial raised about sand mining in our rivers. It's also happening in our marine ecosystems as well. Every year we have about 6 billion tons of marine sand that is being mined, and much of it is being mined illegally. So it has a devastating impact on the marine life, on the marine ecosystems, but basically on the entire marine environment. Maybe to close off, Matthew, would like to share it's something that you've touched on about the impacts of the climate crisis on our water system. And now the climate crisis as a threat multiplier is sort of multiplying and amplifying the threats and challenges that we are facing with regards to our water commons. So doing some progressive projecting politics as well, looking into the future. How is the climate crisis impacting our water commons, and what struggles are emerging from that? What responses are emerging from that? What threats are emerging from that also?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And before I do end off, just to say thank you to you and all the listeners and the questions. It was really interesting. But just to finalize my comments on all the questions around illegal use, lack of governance, privatization of water, every theme that's been touched on today, I think is emblematic of, in some ways, the value system around neoliberal capital. And but really it is exposing, the climate crisis exposes to a level that we haven't seen before, really, the limits of neoliberal governance, hoping that if we have enough money and we can privatize enough and we can commodify enough, we can solve these problems. Cape Town Day Zero shows that. And the day zeros that are extending over and over throughout the entire country. By privatizing water, by increasing tariffs, by hoping that we govern in that manner, as in a neoliberal sort of country, there's no future to that kind of thinking. And certainly that thinking is only going to increase the hardships of those already most affected. So really we need to think about systemic reform and a deep just transition in South Africa. And I think the Climate Justice Charter movement is putting forward very fundamental ways of rethinking governance, community action, and the valuation and control of our natural resources. So thank you, Charles, and thank you to all the listeners. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for making the time. We really appreciate your insights. Just to say to all the colleagues in attendance that the Climate Justice Charter has worked on a water policy for South Africa. Ferial was leading research on the development of that policy. You can download it. It's available on the Climate Justice Charter Movement website. I've just shared in the chat the People's Food Sovereignty Act that we are currently in the process of updating. And Matthew touched upon it in his presentation. We are currently engaging with communities on how to update the People's Food Sovereignty Act to meet the challenges that we currently face. We know that carbon capitalism is looking at building new enclosures, and we have to always keep one step ahead, but also ensuring that we build, systemic alternatives from below that are community-led, that are people-led, and that are movement-led. Our next webinar will be focusing on food sovereignty and the ocean commons, threats and challenges to our ocean commons. We are aware there's growing extractivism. The upstream petroleum development bill, the gas bill, they are all being accelerated to enable the extraction of oil from our oceans. And several communities, of course, are being disadvantaged and they're being left behind. So I'd like to thank everyone for making the time to join us today. Again, appreciation to Matthew and Ferial. Thank you so much. We will put details of the next webinar. We will send it to everyone. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, everyone.